Okay, we are recording for Stephen King's fairy tale. Let's go ahead and get some room tone. Okay, and music is coming in 3, 2. What?
No, I'm just clearing my throat.
Just
Loose
okay.
lips sink ships.
3, 2. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today.
Oh.
Because today we're talking about a book from an author, famous author that we've yet to cover on the show, being Stephen King, and one of his brief forays into fantasy, fairy tale. Now, I know people who have been listening to the show lately must be going, fairy tale? Wasn't that on Friends Pitching Fantasy? And didn't Dylan not pick Fairy Tale by Stephen King? And I would say to you, yes, fantastic memory. Appreciate you listening and picking up on that. It is true.
Rate 5 stars.
Yeah, you are a prime candidate for rating 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or both. And you would be correct. Dylan chose to read the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb instead. But I got a confession to make, guys. We were ahead on the reading schedule. I had some downtime, and I was reading this book on the side. And my thought was either A, Dylan picks it, and I'm on schedule with the reading, which is great, or B, he doesn't pick it, and then we get to have like an extra episode while we do the reading for the other books. Because, hey, Ship of Magic, the first book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy, is very long. So, it just gives us more time to digest that wonderful story, doesn't it, Dylan?
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm about to go on a trip to Japan for a while, so all of these are pre-recorded episodes, and it's like we did just choose the next book to read, but then like the next month of episodes we won't have read it because we'd already recorded them. So it's kind of a confusing situation. I'm sure everyone's confused that fairy tales coming up in their feed and that the books we actually chose won't come up for like a while after they were picked. I have to say, Charles, I feel kind of betrayed by this whole situation. Like the secrecy around it, I think is what
wasn't
what
a secret.
hurt.
It wasn't
like,
a
I literally
secret.
got a text. I got a text from you. Oh, God. I'm gonna have to go.
Here's what happened. I was gonna text you. I was like, "Hey, I just finished Fairy Tale. I could just do a discussion on that." And then I realized I never told you I was reading it because three things happened. Right. The first thing that happened was I was doing a long road trip. And so I needed a fresh audiobook for the drive. It was like 16 hours round trip in the car. And so I started it literally after FPF, but cranked out a ton of it. The second thing was FPF was going on, and I didn't, we hadn't recorded the reveal episode yet, and I didn't want to sway your...
oh, how noble.
Sway your decision one way or the other, because I didn't want to feel like I'd forced your hand into picking something I'd started reading, or vice versa. You'd have been like, "Oh, he started reading it."
Charles, how long have you known me, and what do you think the likelihood of me just picking Fairy Tale because you decide to go ahead and read it would be?
I think it'd be more likely you wouldn't pick it to mess with me. But either way, I didn't want to find out. I wanted it to be more organic. And then the third was I just forgot, I cranked out a lot of it by accident. And then I was like, okay, FPF is over. I just finished this. Dylan's, I gotta be like, so I accidentally read this book.
No, this is how you phrased it in the text.
Yeah.
This was last Sunday, so we're recording this on a Friday, and this was the Sunday before. You're way in the future listening to this episode, as I said, because they're all pre-recorded for a while. But point being, this is like 5 days ago, and you said after complaining about something, whining, you said, anyway, FYI, I've been reading Fairy Tale on the DL for a while now, and I just finished today. I was like, what? What is the reason to be keeping this a secret from me? I was like,
it was an accident. The turnaround was quick, man. I read it fast.
I said, how long have you been reading it? You said, after we record FPF, maybe 2 weeks. I said, sketchy move. But yeah, we can record an episode on it this week.
Hey, but you know
sketchy
what?
Move for all around.
I acknowledge it was a little sketch, but it was not intentional. It was I had a long road trip. I wanted something fresh. Oh, here's the other thing. I had taken all the books that were on FPF and I started borrowing them from the library, and almost all of them had a hold except for this one. So I was like, okay, well, this is the one I'm going to listen to also. That's how I ended up choosing it. I forgot to mention that. So it's not like I had singled it out for any particular reason other than it was available, and so I was listening to it. And I'm glad I did, and I want to get into that. I think at this point now, the best thing we can do is to read the synopsis of Stephen King's Fairy Tale. I'm going to pull up the book here, and we can go ahead and get this going here. A #1 New York Times bestseller, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. It was also a Goodreads Choice Award nominee for Best Fantasy in 2022. Legendary storyteller Stephen King goes into the deepest well of his imagination. That's wordplay, because there's a well in this book. In the spellbinding novel about a 17-year-old boy who inherits the keys to a parallel world where good and evil are at war, and the stakes could not be higher for that world or ours. Charlie Reed looks like a regular high school kid, great at baseball and football, decent student, but he carries a heavy load. His mom was killed in a horrific accident when he was 7, which is how the book opens, not a spoiler, and grief drove his dad to drink. Charlie learned how to take care of himself and his dad. When Charlie is 17, he meets a dog named Radar and her aging master, Howard Bowditch, a recluse in a big house at the top of a big hill, with a locked shed in the backyard. Sometimes strange sounds emerge from it, and then it keeps going and going. Magnificent, terrifying, and spellbinding, packed with glorious flights of imagination and characteristic tenderness about childhood. Fairy Tale is vintage King at his finest. And so that brings us to Fairy Tale. That synopsis is super long. I skipped like 2/3 of it. I was like, I'm not going to continue
synopses that just like devolves into just glowing praise about the author. Which are always interesting.
When the author name is a bigger font size than the book title, you're in a special realm here. And that's kind of what's interesting about this book. Like, typically when we look at the Goodreads for books that we're considering, we see a lot of reviewers like in the circle that we are familiar with, and this one totally different. And I think we're just in a different realm of like book literature fans, coming from the Stephen King world, that are fans of Stephen King or fans of more popular release, like mainstream releases, that also like this is his fantasy like divergence. So it's kind of an interesting audience.
Just the meta of it, Charles, that much like Charlie Reed, the
titular
Charlie Reed, the main character of Fairy Tale ventures into what sounds like a totally new world by nature of this key. Our Charlie reads with an A. Charlie reads until he too has entered a new world entirely, and he finds himself on Goodreads not recognizing any of the reviewers, and he ventures, an intrepid explorer into the realms of mainstream fiction instead of just
Right.
our little SFF community. And the
Very
stakes could
well
not be
said.
higher.
The stakes could not be higher, and as Charlie who reads, R-E-A-D-S, not to be confused with Charlie Reed, the main character of the story, I have to tell you, we had talked about in an earlier episode our limited reading of Stephen King, basically non-existent. This was one of the first, because I haven't read Dark Tower, which is another popular fantasy series, gunslinger fantasy series written by Stephen King a long time ago, and it's probably his most famous fantasy work, I would say. This one is more recent, only 2 years old, and I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know like how horrific is this going to be, how like grotesque or gory or suspenseful or nightmarish
How
is
many
this going
clowns?
to be. How many killer clowns are there going to be, or like spider gods, or weird scenes with women or children, how much of that is going to be portrayed in this book. But I was pleasantly surprised. I could tell, I was reading it and I was like, this is why this man is like top of the game, right? Because he's writing what is at the surface level a pretty straightforward, think of like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe type situation where this kid goes from a normal world, stumbles into a fantasy world through a portal, right? But it's Stephen King's ability to entertain and keep you going, and you're constantly just like aware of what's going on. You're following it, no problem. You're having a good time. You're entertained. That is a very skillful thing to do for any author, especially a fantasy author, in my opinion. Like we've read several fantasy books that are more challenging, and some are like that on purpose to offer that different reading experience. But I don't know, sometimes for me it's like, am I fully understanding what's happening right now? Like, is this something I should be paying attention to? Like, do I understand what's happening? Never an issue.
The stakes are high there, Charles. Never higher, because then we have to discuss the books in depth in our like deep dive episodes for like over an hour. So it is tough when we're reading books like that and we're like, it's not just your normal, if you kind of don't follow a book and then you just move on with your life. We have to put ourselves out there, lay ourselves bare discussing these books. So Charles, it sounds like Fairy Tale didn't fall into those trappings for you. You just kind of were easily absorbed and able to follow everything that's happening, and that's what you need for a mainstream hit.
It's hard to like get into the synopsis too much, and I'm glad that I looked at it, because I'm like, how much of this would be a spoiler and how much of this is just the synopsis of the book? Because what's interesting about this story is it's relatively long, and it almost like is 2 or 3 completely different. Like the story goes in very different directions. Like it starts as like a family drama about a teenager whose mom dies and like is growing up with an alcoholic father and starts taking care of this old man. And that's for like a third of the book. There's no fantasy element, no horror element, just straight up like teenage slice of life drama. Then it like hard 180s into like a fantasy Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe kind of thing, and then it hard 180s again, which I won't get into, other than to say that it delves deeper into the fantasy and maybe some of Stephen King's more like suspense kind of stuff. And so like it's kind of interesting to read a book like that where the narrative departs so drastically, like a third of the way in and then 2/3 of the way in. It's like a different way to structure the story that kept me surprised. And what I thought was interesting was, and from the very beginning, he references the movie Psycho multiple times. Have you seen the movie Psycho, Dylan?
I have not.
Ooh. Well, people who watch it, Alfred Hitchcock's classic from 1960, Psycho, anyone who watches that knows that the story in that does an abrupt 180 as well. Like, you think you're following this woman who like stole money and is on the run, and then all of a sudden she goes to the Bates Motel, and then like the movie just whoop completely changes. So I think he was bringing it up on purpose, and I think he knowingly was like, I'm going to drastically shift this story multiple times, and it kind of works. I don't know, like, you get sucked into the drama aspect where he's going to school, he's going to sports practice, the coach is talking to him, he's, you know, talking to the doctor about how to care for this old man, and he's going and like he's giving him medicine and walking the dog and all these things, and it's like hundreds of pages this is happening, and you're like, how is this a fantasy story? You know, so, and it worked to I think a surprising effect. And I always enjoy stories where like you think you're in one kind of story and then you realize you're in another kind way later. It just makes it that much more interesting. It changes things up. It lets you invest yourself in the character in a different way, so that when stuff hits the fan later on, you can kind of react differently. I don't know, it was super interesting. It's unusual compared to a lot of the fantasy that we've read, and I guess you can compare it to like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Like, they find that wardrobe in like no time. They're like, okay, oh, we're in the house, blah, blah, we're bored. Ooh, wardrobe, boom. This is not the case in this at all. It's a long time before he goes, oh, there's a well here? Whoa, new fantasy world. So it's odd. Like, imagine if they didn't go to the wardrobe until, like, 200 pages in. You'd be like, this is weird. 300 pages in. Like, isn't this a book about a wardrobe?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Stephen King obviously has the writing chops to just get you invested in a story that's reading like a normal fiction story about a boy having to deal with more normal kind of drama rather than fantasy kind of drama, and then gets into that portal fantasy aspect that you're touching on. I'm trying to think
Parallel
what other
worlds.
Portal fantasy I've read.
He does reference,
Lion.
You're going to hate that I brought this up, but he does reference Piers Anthony as well. Where it's like, like parallel worlds, like in those Piers Anthony novels you used to read. And I'm here thinking, like, what teenager in the 20-teens has read Piers Anthony and seen Psycho? I'm like, literally none of them have. But
no,
it's like, this kid is
King
like
completely like out of touch with what a modern teenager is like. Oh, you mean like in Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses?
Exactly. Because there's so many references that this kid makes. I'm like, is he supposed to be 16 in 2012? Like, there's no way he's seen Psycho and read H.P. Lovecraft and like read Piers
and like
Anthony.
Piers Anthony is
also really good at football and baseball. It's like super. Like he made him like a good typical hero on purpose, but it felt kind of odd when he was in his like, I'm just a regular teenager mode. It's like, you have the tastes of Stephen King.
Stephen King,
like a 70-year-old man.
You have the tastes of Stephen King.
Yeah, like you like, and he like, I think he also mentioned he liked hard rock music and like played the guitar, and I'm like, dude, this is okay. But other than that, the characters...
That's a lot of hobbies. To be like legit into film, to be legitimately into reading fantasy, and to be playing guitar, learning guitar, and baseball, and football. It's like... and taking care of your dad.
An alcoholic dad, and you're taking care of an old man. Because like there was this crotchety old man that everyone's too afraid to talk to, and he just like he walks by one day and he like the old man falls off a ladder in front of his house, and so Charlie ends up taking care of him and breaking down those walls, and that's a ton of the beginning of this book is dedicated to that. And I don't want to get too much into the plot, but what's interesting is it becomes very much about this old man, and then he has an old dog as well. And this is another thing, that the dog's name is Radar. Huge character in this. I'd say for all you dog lovers out there, book is fantastic because it really captures the relationship of like a young kid and their dog and the loyalty of animals and this and that. It's really, really good. And one of the central plots revolves around like these three characters, Charlie, Radar, and Mr. Bowditch. So super, super interesting there. So yeah, dog fans unite. And then it does get, I guess people are wondering like, oh, it's by Stephen King. Does it get spooky and scary? And it does about 2/3 of the way in. It does get some kind of graphic content. People do die. There is a little bit of blood and guts. There's, some of that content warning stuff. I don't think it's as heavy as something like Joe Abercrombie where people are getting actively tortured and it's horrible, but it's more like, ooh, spooky, scary kind of stuff. It's still heavy and intense and it delivers, but it's not like over the top. It's not what this book is. Like, I wouldn't describe this as like a violent or graphic book at all. It's like the fantasy violence, like a Sanderson kind of violence with maybe a little bit more detail to the details of some of the more unfortunate things that happen to characters. But and they get put in some pretty rough spots too. Like the story's long enough where it goes all over the place, which I think is to its benefit. So
yeah, Charles. So you've been touching on this already, but I'm curious, what do you feel like was the greatest strength or the greatest strengths of this work?
I would definitely say the greatest strength is the way that Stephen King balances classic elements of fantasy with his signature entertainment value, suspense, and for a modern audience. Like, there's literally parts where the longer this kid spends in this parallel world, his hair becomes more blonde and his eyes go from brown to blue, and he makes jokes about it. Like, oh, I'm supposed to be this prince or whatever, like typical white male hero. Like, it's very acknowledging of these fairy tales while also like honoring the format. So it takes the format of these classic stories, and he mentions a ton, like Rumpelstiltskin, Jack and the Beanstalk, to all the way to like Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all these. He's pulling from all of these very intentionally, and he's not subtle about bringing those names in and making those comparisons, since you have a kid from 2012 or whatever. So that to me was the most interesting part. It was like, here's a guy who knows how to write books made for movies, for mass audiences, just like super entertaining guy. And he's like, okay, what if I take all the classic beats of a fantasy, good versus evil, parallel world, only you can save us kind of thing, and put my stamp on it. And that was the most interesting part for sure, because Stephen King adds that little bit of element of this could go badly at this point where typically it wouldn't. Like, it could go bad, and this book is long enough and has a tendency to hard 180 enough that like it could go in that direction. So it was kind of fun to watch him explore these classical fantasy elements just as like a, I guess more often than not, like a bystander fan of fantasy who's like, maybe I can try, and steps in, So it was fun to see that for sure.
That's well said, Charles. There's sounds like an awareness of genre, even if some of the fantasy aspects of it are, I won't say outdated, but at least
traditional,
older than, more traditional. He's not like talking about Sanderson books or anything like that. He's referencing things like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then some of the like classic fairy tales, which are relevant to the book, I assume, because it's called
Big Time
Fairy Tale. It's not called fantasy, science fiction, and fantasy novel.
Speculative fiction tale.
Speculative fiction tale.
Romantasy tale.
Yeah, that's the next one. Who knows? That might be the biggest seller based on what the other romantasy books do. But
if I was him, I'd be getting writing on that big time.
Yeah, Stephen King definitely needs more money. That's the one thing that he's like, how do I make some money doing this?
It's like, I need to break into the mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's probably at a point he can write whatever he wants. But so I'm thinking about something that happened when you had pitched Fairy Tale is we had a bunch of people, or at least a few, we had multiple people for sure, who wrote in to tell me specifically that they don't think I should start reading Stephen King with Fairy Tale. Like, having heard that, I was like, well, I haven't really read, like, embarrassingly, I haven't really read much Stephen King outside of us reading the Shawshank Redemption short story in Mr. Miller's English class. And my only other real experience is the whole story I've probably told like 8 or 9 times on this podcast around when I was supposed to write and
faking a book report for It. Yes.
Yeah, for Mr. Miller's class on It by Stephen King, and then I wrote it based on Wikipedia page for the movie. That is my experience, and they were like, "Don't
old
start
movie,
with Fairy Tale."
The modern movie hadn't been out yet. This was like the Stephen Curry TV 2-part TV movie.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Because it was long enough ago that they didn't really have a good Wikipedia entry for the book at that point, which is wacky to think. But we're getting older, Charles. Some of us more than others.
Telling the same stories over and over.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's probably like the most told story on this podcast. But
I feel like it's happening a lot recently because we keep bringing up Stephen King now. But I think I know where your question's going. Is this a good
Yeah, I mean, you haven't read a lot of Stephen King either. Like, I had people reaching out and they were like Stephen King fans, but they would say like, don't start with Fairy Tale. Like, start with we had some people say like, start with something that you haven't seen a movie of but is big, which for me I ended up thinking like The Stand would be one, because I haven't seen, there is an adaptation I think, but I haven't seen it, and I was like, not gonna start.
As far as I can tell, this book, while it was like a New York Times bestseller and certainly gets a lot of like publicity or promotion or placement, I'll say, distribution online, I've never heard anyone talk about it. No one's ever recommended it to me. So I feel like it's one of those books that's like, look, a Stephen King book is going to deliver on a good reading experience no matter what. Like, he's dialed in to the point where he can write that, unless it was like back in his like coke fueled days where he was writing just crazy stuff. But like, I feel like for the most part, you're going to get that 7 out of 10 experience. But I think his best work, the things he's most famous for in a completely different genre, in a completely different period of time. So it's kind of hard to say like, oh, start here, don't start here. I will say anyone looking to read just an entertaining fantasy world and just get absorbed in a story for a month or so. I remember we did a fantasy recommendations episode on books to take on vacation. I think this would be a great book for that. It's just delivers, man. I feel like it's like if you were going to say, oh, I'm thinking about reading Brandon Sanderson, I want to start with like Yumi and the Nightmare Painter or Emperor's Soul. Whoa. It's like weird place to start, but yeah, I'm sure that's a very good book. It's just like not what he typically
out
writes.
Of nowhere at Yumi. So it's just a lot of weird energy coming from you, Charles, around
but
this
whole recent
what I'm saying. The whole most recent Friends Pitching Fantasy. Like, there's just some weird energy coming from you around it. Like, Yumi was pitched. You chose it. Where's this resentment coming from?
It's not resentment. I mean, imagine if someone was saying, I've never read Sanderson before, so I decided to pick up Yumi. I mean, you'd be like, well, that's his, like, he's branching out with that kind of a story. I'm sure it's going to be very good, but it is just a weird place to start. Like, there's other places you would go.
No, I get that.
And so it's just one of those things where it's like, this is kind of the same way. It's like, wow, you picked his one not horror suspense story that he wrote way later in his career and this and that. Like, you know, so I can get why we got that comment quite a bit. But I would say to anyone considering reading this book that don't let that deter you, because, you know, the entertainment value is there, the execution is there, the talent is there. Like, you're gonna get absorbed, you're gonna get engrossed in the story, you're gonna be following Charlie riding his bike down the street, to all the way to doing crazy stuff in a fantasy world against like evil monsters. So like you'll be taken that whole way, and that to me it makes it a valuable experience worth reading on its own. Whether it's a good like showcase for what Stephen King's library is like, it's probably not. I haven't read enough Stephen King to know for sure, but I could see, based on fan feedback and what I know Stephen King typically writes, that it's a bit atypical for him in his writing career.
Yeah. I mean, he's kind of reached that point where it's like, oh, another Stephen King book. It's going to be a huge seller, but like you've said, it's not like something that people are actively talking about or recommending that much. Yeah. It's just he occupies just a really weird, unique space at this point.
Right. Like, imagine if Sanderson wrote it in a totally different genre for the first time, and you'd be like, okay, I'm obviously going to read that, but is that going to be the thing where it's like, don't start there. Wow, you're picking like his like least popular work. You should read instead The Way of Kings or something. It's like, yeah, I mean, I probably would enjoy that too, and that's probably his more famous work, but that doesn't make this story bad. The story was actually quite good. I was impressed by it.
It sounds like you were, Charles, and you're entertained, and at a certain base level, isn't that what reading is about? Of course, we love when things challenge us, when we really learn a lot about ourselves or the world or what have you through the lens of fiction. But sometimes we're just on a really long road trip like you were and need a good audiobook to
It's great for a road trip, and let me tell you, the audiobook is fantastic. The narrator, I don't remember who they are, super, super good. And I was pleasantly surprised. There's one moment, I won't say when, where for a brief moment and a very suspenseful moment, something happens that the audiobook is able to deliver on uniquely that the book couldn't. Like, I'm sure the scene was still suspenseful in the book, but it's one of those moments where they spice it up just for one brief moment in a 40-hour-long audiobook where you're like, ooh, spooky, like, interesting. And then it goes back and it never deters again. So super interesting. Like, it's also a bit of a meta Easter egg too, which I won't get into. I'll let the fans enjoy that. But it was fun. I had a great time with it. Great performance. Like, perfect audiobook drive. Perfect. If I was just reading this on vacation, like, I would have been very happy, because you put it down and then you're done. It's longer, so you have to read pretty quickly depending on how long your vacation is, but it's perfect for that. And it still has some pretty solid themes around, well, good versus evil, coming of age, obviously. They have an interesting one about, I would call it, I guess, the power of stories, because Stephen King focuses a lot on storytelling and myth in this. Like I said, he goes from mentioning Rumpelstiltskin all the way to Psycho and beyond. Nailed it. And Charlie's like making parallels to some of these stories with what's going on in his own life, and then it invites some interesting comparisons. And like I said, it's a modern perspective on some of these things where it's like, oh, the young white male teenager goes to another world, becomes the chosen prince, and saves everybody. That's the story that's being set up. And so how he's using the significance of that to tell this story was interesting. Lots of stuff about courage and heroism and friendship and loyalty. Like I said, most of it revolves around Radar the dog, and testing the friendship and loyalty between Charlie and Mr. Bowditch and Radar. So really great story for dog lovers. And then there's redemption and forgiveness, I'd say, is the other one. So pretty high level stuff. Themes. Yeah, it's rooted in these very classic.
He's playing the hits.
He's playing the hits. but the way he delivers it is super bizarre. Like how he focuses, like he tells like 3 separate stories and strings them into one story. It's like really interesting. It's that psycho approach of like, I was writing a family drama, but now I'm gonna write Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe, and now I'm gonna write a Hunger Games meets like horror element, and now I'm gonna write this. Like it goes in all these crazy directions, and you're like, what? Hard to imagine that this was the same book that started with this kid riding his bike 600 pages ago.
Is it a Bildungsroman, Charles?
I guess technically, yeah, because it is about a teenager who's growing up. It's a coming of age thing. Probably not as more traditional as like Wizard of Earthsea is. It's not nearly as introspective as that. Like it's very surface level in terms of the characters' like mental development. Like he started pretty much perfect and ended pretty much perfect, so not too much challenging with Charlie there. But because he's always like, I'm gonna do this because I want to take care of this old man, or I want to take care of this, protect this dog, or like, oh, I want to protect these people even though I just met them. I'm willing to do some really risk my life kind of stuff for this person I just met. Like he's doing that constantly. So there's kind of nowhere to go from there. Whereas usually characters in Bildungsroman are either like selfish or have flaws of some kind.
Yeah.
But he's like, from the beginning, he's like, I was making pancakes for my alcoholic dad. That's how it starts, It's just like, this kid is a saint from the beginning. So I'd say that's maybe the weakest part, but fair. I think he was trying to do so much narratively that he was like, I don't have time for character work. I don't have time for that at all.
So character development, not the strength of this book. But
no.
Charles, let's put ourselves in the shoes of Paul Greengrass. All right.
Oh boy. I was thinking of that this whole time. I was thinking of poor Paul Greengrass and Goodman because this is, to me, seems like a nightmare
who these
to adapt.
People are before. Yeah. So Paul Greengrass is a real person. Something about green grass is just like, sounds like the fakest name. It sounds like Charlie Reed. Or the other characters. And then alongside Greg Goodman, I mean, these people they're real. They're going to produce the film adaptation together.
It's going to be tough.
When you get Goodman and Greengrass together, you never know what can happen, Charles. But you said you're not exactly green with envy over what Paul has to pull off.
I was thinking that. I was like, how do you go about adapting this, especially to a film, like where you're limited to like 2 hours, because so much stuff happens. You'll have to cut a ton of it just to get to where you need to go. You could make 3 movies out of this easily, but I don't think it's got enough like energy behind it to support a trilogy of movies over a bunch of years. It's not that epic. Like maybe you could make it a series, but for film, it's going to be tough. I don't envy them at all because, like I said, it's told in like 3 or 4 different really long beats. I can't imagine how that translates. You'd have to cut a ton of it.
I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of room to cut at the beginning anyway, if it's 30% of it. Like, I feel like we could pretty easily get the idea of like, oh, this is a good kid who's plays some sports and takes care of his alcoholic dad and blah blah. And let's get it moving, I would think. I mean,
but then it's like the dad goes to AA and he gets better and he starts his own business. Like so much stuff happens.
Yeah, but
there's a lot of
need
detail.
that probably
exactly, but it's like how much of that breathes life into the Charlie character and how much of that can be cut for time. I don't like, it's tough. And I think a lot of it could probably be cut, but I guess it depends, like, what kind of movie do you want to make? Do you want to make, like, a drama, or do you want to make, like, a high fantasy film? Because you could go either direction with this, Do you want to make, like...
Yeah.
I don't know, like Lord of the Rings meets like a Marley and Me kind of thing meets like a Stephen King horror movie. Like, I don't know if that's what you want to do, go for it. But I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah, that is
Don't
tough.
envy them at all.
I mean,
I will be watching because I'm always curious about adaptations. It is such an art form.
It seems like this one then might have just fallen into the category of Stephen King wrote a book, so I guess let's adapt it rather than
I can see the trailer right now. From the mind of Stephen King, in big text comes fairy tale. You know, like from the people who brought from the mind of It. Remember when It came out and everyone went to see it? It's this again, but fantasy. I don't know.
Yeah.
Are they going to make it spooky? Are they going to make it R-rated? Like, there's not a lot of R-rated stuff that happens. You could easily make it an R-rated movie, but you don't have to. So I don't know. All in all, though, I think I would definitely recommend it for, fans of more traditional modern fantasy. I think there's a lot to enjoy with it. I think it's I can appreciate Stephen King's writing ability. Like, I see what it takes as an author to be like, where your name is bigger than the title of your book. Like, when you have that kind of momentum behind you, I can see how you get there. It's because you're able to deliver on the reading experience reliably and consistently, and that becomes the draw. And that's really what this was. It was like, hey, really good author throwing his hat in the ring on some traditional fantasy storytelling elements, and it was a fun, entertaining story that I'm glad I read and I'd happily recommend to anyone else. So that's it, man. Yeah, that's my recommendation for Fairy Tale. I'm glad we're also getting to read Live Ship Traders. I'm very excited about that, but I'm also glad we got to give this book a little bit of a moment.
Yeah, well, you heard it here first, folks. Stephen King, good at writing, fairy tale.
That's my brave stance.
Entertaining story. And that's the kind of stuff that you can expect over here at the Friends
Take
Talking
it on
Fantasy
vacation.
podcast.
It's a strong standalone that will take you through a nice narrative. It's really good.
Yeah,
I highly recommend. It's got a character named Charlie in it.
That's true. Can't beat that.
What more do you need?
I think at this point, all we need is that sweet, sweet outro music, Charles. I think you've said it all.
Agree.
On Stephen King's fairy tale that you can while keeping the spoiler free. Who knows? Maybe one day we will finally read Stephen King on this podcast together. And maybe it'll be fairy tale.
Come back to the well. Ooh, that's another.
Yeah,
that's another fairy tale reference. You wouldn't get it, but
I wouldn't get it.
It's a good one. Rest assured. I'm gonna get that outro music going now.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. Now, Dylan, I gotta still plug the socials. If you want to support the show, the best way to do that is over on the socials by following us there and engaging with us over there. And that is at the FTF podcast on Instagram and Twitter. And then at the FTF podcast with a number 1 at the end for Twitter. Did I say all that right? Instagram and TikTok not. Is at the FTF podcast, okay? And then Twitter is at the FTF podcast 1. Okay. There's too many, all these platforms, like, dude, social media.
I don't know what Twitter is. All I know is X, but
I wish social media didn't exist, man. but it does, and it's so helpful for you guys to engage with us over there. I think.
If social media
I don't know
didn't
anymore.
Exist, Charles, FTF podcast would have no listeners.
It's what I like is that we get to talk to you guys. That's that part I don't want to lose. It's all the different platforms, name changes, and whatever. We don't need that stuff in our lives, but we need you because that's what makes this fun and we're doing it. Dylan, if they want to support the show and engage with us, but they also are over the whole social media thing, what can they do?
You have to go on social media to toss 5 stars to our podcast, because you can do that over on Spotify. Just go to the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, click About for some reason, and then click where the stars are. Throw us 5 of them. Means a lot when you do that. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That means you can say nice things about us. You can say things like, "Hey, Charles, I don't think you sound crotchety at all with your takes on social media, with your anger when it comes to the idea of..."
over and over.
Yeah.
Like, kids these days kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, Charles, we love you anyway, and...
In the movie, it was older and Wikipedia articles weren't reliable.
Yeah, back when I was in high school, they didn't even have a Wikipedia article for a book by Stephen King. Can you believe that? So, if you can believe that, then toss us 5 stars. If you can't believe us, still toss us 5 stars. But you don't have to do that, really, because just listening is more than enough.
Well said, Dylan, and I wholeheartedly agree. Listening is more than enough. Thank you guys so much for doing that. You guys are awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends. Made it to the end of the song. That's the first.
Wow. It's a low point.